Bigfoot is a demonic entity from an alternate dimension. They started as a tribe of Nephilim. Most of the Nephilim were wiped out during the flood, Noah's Ark. But some remained. God banished them to an alternate dimension. It is not safe for them to raise their young in their dimension. They are cannibalistic creatures. So they come here to give birth and raise their children. So, Bigfoots are always female or juvenile males. The adult males are too big to come here. As with all interdimensional beings, they cannot transfer to their dimension if they are in the line of sight of a human. So they duck into the woods and disappear.
In 1971, a Marine guard at 29 Palms military base experienced something that would defy explanation. His experience would trigger a series of mysterious sightings across the Mojave Desert spanning decades. The FBI and CIA even got involved. And the worst part, all of it seems to stem around the Joshua Tree National Park. These are 3 secrets park rangers will never tell you. On a warm summer night in 1971, a Marine guard was standing at his post at the 29 Palms military base in Southern California. The base sprawled across this huge stretch of desert, and at night, it got so dark out there that you could barely see your hand in front of your face. This guard had done this shift plenty of times before, and usually nothing ever happened. He had started his shift at 2300 hours, and he knew he'd be out here until 5 in the morning. He had his standard issue M16 rifle slung across his chest, and he carried his flashlight in his right hand, though he rarely used it. Using a light out here just killed your night vision, and it made you an easy target. The temperature had dropped to about 65 degrees, which was actually pretty nice for this part of the desert. And every couple of minutes, he'd key his radio and check in with his command post. All of it just standard procedure. And between radio checks, he'd stop at each of his designated posts, marking his activity log with the time and his observations. He had just finished writing all clear in his log for the 3rd time that night when things began to happen. At the time, most of the other Marines were asleep in their barracks, and the guard was just doing his normal rounds, walking the perimeter, checking all the usual spots. And every now and then, he would just stop and listen, and at one point or another, he began to hear a noise he wasn't familiar with. It was like this strange, shuffling sound, but it was coming from off in the darkness. He couldn't see what it was, and he just kept thinking how odd this was, that maybe it was just the wind picking up some dust. And so he gets closer to investigate, and out of nowhere, this massive figure emerged right in front of him. It was so large that it blocked out the stars behind it, and as it got closer, he could see that it was covered in this thick, matted, nasty hair. It looked almost human-like in its shape, but there was no way it could be human. It was just way too massive. The Marine guard immediately went into his training. He called out for this thing to stop right where it was, but it just kept coming toward him. And so he raised his rifle, aiming it directly at the center of this massive shape. But then it reached out with one of its massive arms, and in one single fluid motion, it grabbed onto his rifle. And then, like it was nothing more than a piece of paper, it just bent the rifle completely in half. He had just enough time to register what had happened before everything went black. The next morning, 2 other Marines doing their rounds found him face down at his post. When they managed to wake him up, he was completely out of it. His eyes were glazed over, he could barely string 2 words together, but he managed to tell them about this massive shape, and right next to where he was his rifle, twisted like a pretzel. No one knew what to make of his story because they knew this guy wasn't a liar, and he was very genuinely spooked about what had happened. As you can imagine, this reached the upper ears of those who worked at this base, and it was taken very seriously. So much so that both the FBI and CIA sent out investigators. During the course of the investigation, something more bizarre came to light. 2 other people on base had seen this same creature that very night. And one of those witnesses claimed they saw something really strange. That whatever this thing was not alone. It had what looked like a smaller version of it walking alongside of it. They put in their official report that based on witness descriptions, this thing had to be at least 12 feet tall. It wasn't just the people on base who knew something was wrong that night. All the people living near the base also told investigators that their dogs had been going crazy, barking all night long. And it was that worried, frantic kind of barking, that dogs do when something is really wrong. It wasn't good, folks. And what's interesting is what happened here seemed to bleed over into nearby areas. Because around that same time, over at Joshua Tree National Park, employees started reporting similar sightings. They were seeing this massive hairy creature moving through the park. Now at the time, they couldn't explain it. Some of them tried to capture evidence of it, but it didn't turn out very well. And within a very short amount of time, all of the sightings just stopped. And for 8 years, there was nothing. There was no sightings, there was no reports. People almost started to forget about it. However, folks, one of the top things that's keeping park staff and hikers alike safe is Bombas socks. Now, wait a minute. Before you skip through this ad, hear me out. Because as someone who's spent countless hours researching these parks and all the strange cases, I know just how crucial proper gear is, especially for your feet. And park rangers walk an average of like 10 miles per day through rough terrain, and they're trying to, fight off Bigfoot and trying to rescue hikers from the unthinkable. So durable socks isn't just about comfort, it's about safety. I've been wearing my Bombas for, quite a while now, and I can tell you these aren't your average socks. And after looking at the 2 years they've spent perfecting every detail like built-in arch support, premium materials like merino wool, and no annoying toe seam that drives you crazy on long hikes, it makes sense that with these you're able to outrun the unthinkable. But what really makes them special is their mission, because for every item purchased, they donate an item to someone in need. In fact, socks are the #1 most requested clothing item in homeless shelters, and Bombas has donated over 150 million essential clothing items to those experiencing homelessness through their network of giving partners. So whether you're hitting the trails yourself or trying to escape a ravenous group of Bigfoot, or you're just looking for the perfect gift for the outdoor enthusiast in your life, these socks have you covered. And new customers get 20% off their first purchase by going to bombas.com/lurks and using code LURKS at checkout. Trust me, your feet will thank you and you'll be safe for the time being. Not to mention you'll be helping someone out in need. In 1979, Mike and Linda Harrison were driving home around 12:30 at night near their condominium in Desert Hot Springs, California. They just left their friend's house where they'd been playing cards, and they were actually in the middle of arguing about whether Linda had misplayed the last hand that cost them the game. Mike was telling Linda she should have led with the ace of spades, and Linda was saying that if Mike had been paying attention, he would have seen why that wouldn't have worked. It was just one of those stupid arguments couples have, but it meant they were both distracted and irritated when they turned onto that dark stretch of road near their complex. The headlights caught this thing perfectly, and what they saw made them completely forget about their card game argument. Standing there in the beam of their headlights was this enormous figure. Its shoulders had to be at least 4 feet wide, and its head almost looked too small for its massive frame. The hair covering its body wasn't matted or tangled like you might expect. It was actually kind of smooth and uniform, almost like a horse's coat, but longer. And its arms were these massive, powerful-looking limbs. They hung down past its knees, swaying as it stood there. The couple noticed its hands and how huge they were, easily twice the size of a normal human hand, with these thick, long fingers. Despite its size, it seemed incredibly agile and balanced. Michael and Linda were just completely speechless. None of them could say a word. Linda grabbed Michael's arm so hard her knuckles were white, even though Michael had his foot hovering over the gas pedal. He just couldn't bring himself to do it. It's like his brain was in shock and wouldn't send the signal to his foot to press down the gas. To Michael and Linda, this experience felt like it would stretch on for minutes at a time, but in actuality, it was probably no more than a few seconds. And in one fluid motion, this thing just glided off into the shadows and vanished into the yucca bushes, and it took Michael and Linda a few moments to kind of gather themselves before they could even drive off. And folks, it doesn't end there, because not even 2 weeks later, someone else would find something truly baffling. Bill Steele had started his morning like he always did. Cup of coffee at 5:30 in the morning, a quick breakfast of eggs and toast, and then out to check the property before the day got too hot. He was driving his old Ford F-150 along the fence line, something he did 3 times a week, looking for any damage from the recent storms. He just passed his east pasture where he kept a small herd of cattle when he noticed some of his fence posts were leaning at an odd angle. So he pulled over, grabbed his tool belt from behind the seat, and walked over to check it out. That's when he saw them, these impressions on the ground. Initially, he thought maybe one of his cows had gotten out and stepped there, but these weren't cow prints. They were clearly footprints, like a human's, but massive, and they went right through his property in a straight line. Whatever made them knew exactly where it was going. Bill had been working in this land since 1946, and he'd never seen anything like it. He actually went back to his truck to grab his reading glasses, thinking maybe his eyes were just playing tricks on him. But even with his glasses on, these prints were just as huge and just as strange. Bill got out his measuring tape and started documenting what he was seeing. Each print was 1.5 feet long. That's about twice the size of a normal man's boot. Bill did his best to replicate the stride himself, but even with his longest possible step, he couldn't come close to matching the distance. He counted 17 distinct prints before they disappeared into rocky terrain. Bill immediately called the local sheriff's office, and word spread quickly about these strange prints. 2 well-known Bigfoot researchers, Tom Wilson and Mark Stevens, drove all the way from Oregon to investigate. But by the time they arrived, 3 days later, a rainstorm had washed away most of the evidence. They took some photographs and measurements of what was left, but the prints were far too degraded to make casts or do any real analysis. You have to understand that back in 1979, awareness of Bigfoot wasn't nearly as prominent as it was today, especially being outside of the Pacific Northwest. I mean, when people thought about the Mojave Desert and the areas around Joshua Tree, they worried about mountain lions, not giant hairy creatures walking around on 2 legs. Even the local papers didn't really know what to call this thing. Some called it a desert giant, others went with mountain monster, but nobody was really using the term Bigfoot. Something else that was very fascinating was just his reaction. Bill had explained that he had seen pictures of Bigfoot prints up from Washington State and around the Pacific Northwest, but all of those looked very different than the ones on his property. These prints had this weird characteristic where the toes, they were spaced much wider apart, kind of like whatever made them was adapted for walking in loose desert sand. Plus, the hair that Mike and Linda Harrison had described seeing was this light tan color, which is totally different from the dark brown or even black hair that is much more commonly reported in the Pacific Northwest. People were starting to realize they might be dealing with something completely different, their own unique desert-dwelling creature. In March of 1988, 2 Marines named Ken Fox and Mike Reynolds were driving back to 29 Palms after spending the day skiing at Big Bear Lake. It was about 9 o'clock at night, and they were taking this shortcut through the desert that would bring them on the way back through Yucca Valley through Landers. The 2 Marines had made this drive plenty of times before, and so they knew just about every turn, including a stretch of road that passed by this old cement factory that just sat there all by itself in the middle of nowhere. There wasn't any other civilization around for about 10 miles in any direction, which isn't really unusual for this part of the Mojave Desert. Ken and Mike had actually been in the middle of planning their next ski trip when it happened. Mike was saying that they should try Mammoth Mountain next time instead of Big Bear Lake, and Ken was arguing that it wasn't worth the extra 3-hour drive. Both men's attention was alerted to something moving in the darkness ahead. Both had been up since 6 in the morning and they were incredibly tired, so it made sense that they both thought their eyes were just playing tricks on them. Now, from the left side of the road, this enormous figure suddenly stood up on 2 legs and started running across the road in front of their car. The headlights caught the bottom half of whatever this thing was, and Ken could see that it looked almost human, but covered in hair. The top half was harder to make out. It was just this dark, massive shape that Ken would later describe as monsterish, and it crossed that entire road about 150 feet in just 3 massive strides, pumping its arms back and forth just like a person would if they were sprinting. Now, for a few seconds, neither Ken nor Mike said anything. They just kind of glanced at each other, both of them unsure of what to do next. And after being stunned momentarily, Mike yanked the car around so fast, their skis went sliding across the back seat. Ken started digging through the glove compartment looking for Mike's wife's pistol that she always kept in there for emergencies. Ken pointed to this dirt road that led off toward the old cement factory and told Mike, "Drive down it now." Now, on this particular night, it was extremely dark, so they had to drive very slowly. And they got about 300 feet towards this small dirt road, and they could see that this factory was just this massive concrete structure, and it just kind of loomed there in the darkness. And they got closer, and they got really bad feelings about where they were at. Both Marines carefully scanned the darkness trying to find this thing, but they still couldn't see it anywhere. And within moments, the men had stopped the car entirely. Even though Ken had found the pistol in the glove compartment, it somehow didn't make him feel any safer. Both sat there for about 10 minutes before Mike reached over and turned the headlights off altogether. When Ken started to protest, Mike just explained that maybe this thing was staying just outside their field of vision, using the darkness to circle around them. They stayed out there for a little while longer, but eventually gave up because they didn't find anything. Now, a few months go by and their enlistments were up. And even though Ken and Mike never officially reported it, they would still talk to each other about it from time to time because it was just so bizarre and out of place. Even nowadays, with how ubiquitous Bigfoot is and cryptids in general, there are many people, especially in the military and in law enforcement, that are still very iffy about talking about this stuff. For these men, they just assumed they had seen some sort of prehistoric man of some kind, and even though it was frightening, they were privileged. However, it wouldn't be till many years later until these men would come forward and share their experience with researchers. The strange man-like beast all of these people reported seeing is what's most commonly known around the area as the Yucca Man. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of witness reports of this thing that go back centuries, and no one really knows what it is. And it makes you wonder what else is hanging out around the Joshua Tree National Park. Now, to this very day, the Yucca Man remains a mystery. At 6:45 in the morning on January 27th, 2012, Dr. William Bill Backus was driving his 2010 Forest Service Jeep Cherokee down Forest Service Road 21, which is about 3 miles from the ranger station. The temperature that morning was around 42 degrees and there was still a light frost on the ground. The morning light was just starting to break through the trees, and Dr. Backus had been the chief scientist at Olympic National Park in Washington State for 15 years. And this morning drive was part of his daily routine. Every morning at 7, he would inspect different sectors of the park, making notes and checking for any issues that needed attention. He was casually driving along lost in thought, and he rounded a bend near the north shore of Lake Quinault, and he suddenly hit the brakes, because what he saw made him get out of his Jeep immediately. There, in front of him, was a scene of absolute destruction. over 100 massive old growth trees were lying on the ground. Huge Douglas firs and western red cedars that had been standing for like 300 years, many of them reaching heights of nearly 200 feet. He grabbed his field notebook and GPS unit and began documenting what he was seeing. The trees were all splayed out in this weird semicircular pattern. Some of them were completely snapped off at about 15 to 20 feet from their base. Others had been completely uprooted, with root systems around 15 feet in diameter exposed to the air. By 7:15, he had radioed in what he'd found, and 30 minutes later, 3 Park Service rangers arrived with their full investigation kit: a Nikon D3200, GPS mapping units, and sample collection equipment. The team began a systematic documentation of the scene. They took photos in a grid pattern every 50 feet, they collected soil samples from different locations, and they even took core samples from the still standing trees nearby. Now, you might be thinking, okay, this isn't that big of a deal because windstorms come through areas and blow down trees. However, folks, this wasn't a windstorm. As these men continued to document and inspect the area, they found something really interesting. Near the drainage outlet, all the trees had fallen towards the southeast, but on the western edge, the trees were lying in a completely different direction, pointing north to south. And then on the eastern edge, the trees were lying east to west. It just didn't make any sense, because if this had been caused by some sort of windstorm, all the trees should have fallen in the same direction. This was clearly more complex than any of them had anticipated, and so they reached out to Dr. Cliff Mass, who is a senior meteorologist at the University of Washington, who had over 30 years of experience studying Pacific Northwest weather patterns. And immediately he began analyzing data from 4 local weather stations, including satellites, 3 ground-based radar systems, and 8 temperature monitoring stations. And he looked at 10,000 data points from the 24 hours before and after the incident. There had been no severe weather in the entire area. In fact, the highest wind speed recorded was only 12 miles per hour. There were no microbursts, no severe temperature changes, nothing in the weather data that could possibly explain what had happened to these trees. Now, he found something equally interesting. At exactly 2:17 that morning, there were 3 nearby seismic monitoring stations that had picked up some kind of event. It only lasted 4 seconds, and it registered as a local magnitude of 1.2. But the wave pattern was completely unusual. They checked everything. They looked for fault line activity. They looked for underground gas pockets. They even checked to see if there had been a military exercise or logging operations. Folks, there was nothing. The weather anomaly was such a big deal that for the following 6 months, they would have research teams from 4 different universities studying this site. Everybody was trying to get to the bottom of what happened. They even called in Scooby-Doo. Well, not really, but and they installed motion sensors, weather stations, seismic monitors, and even wildlife cameras. And after various official reports and publications and 3 scientific papers and dozens of Forest Service documentation that was compiled, they still were just as far away from an answer as they were when they started. Somehow, someway, something had knocked down over 100 massive old growth trees that had been standing for centuries and had arranged them in a bizarre circular pattern. But whatever that something was, it left absolutely no trace of itself behind. And to this day, the incident remains one of the most puzzling cases in Washington State's history. Even with all of our modern technology and expertise, nature can still present us with mysteries we simply can't solve. At 11 in the morning, Stephanie was standing in their motel room looking at the clock. Paul still hadn't returned, and they needed to check out, like now. But she wasn't too worried because she figured maybe Paul had just lost track of time taking photos on the trail. But by 11:30, Stephanie's mild concern had turned into real worry. Paul was always very reliable and very punctual, and he knew very well they had to check out of the motel. So she called the park rangers and told them that her husband had not yet come back from his hike. Well, at 2 p.m., the park launched a full search and rescue operation, and over the next 5 days, more than 600 people would join on the search. They logged well over 6,000 hours looking for Paul, and at the peak of the search, there were 90 people on the ground, including 20 different dog teams. ATVs combed the accessible areas while choppers searched from above. You had multiple agencies showing up to help: the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department, the California Rescue Dog Association, you had Nevada Search and Rescue, and the National Park Service. But after 5 days of searching, they hadn't found a single trace of Paul. Not his camera, not his hat, not his water pack. There was no signs of him. The official search had to be scaled back. And over the next year and a half, Paul's family organized their own searches. They tried everything: infrared detection, high-resolution aerial photography, more canine teams, but Paul seemed to have completely vanished on that trail. In November of 2019, Paul's sister, Dawn Robinson, was not ready to give up. She managed to get permission for one last search attempt. This time, she brought in a company called Western States Aerial Search to fly drones over the area. The drone team took 6,711 high-res photos of the terrain. They were looking for anything unusual, anything that didn't belong in the natural landscape. And a group of volunteers began going through these photos one by one. You can imagine how painstaking that would be. But on December 19th, someone spotted something in one of the photos. They couldn't tell exactly what it was, but it didn't look natural, so they sent GPS coordinates to the rangers. The following morning, rangers had hiked out to that location, and the first thing they found was a dark pair of cargo shorts. They were size 32 and made in Canada. A few feet away, they found a tan military-style boot, size 9, and as they continued searching the area, they made another discovery. There, partially hidden from view, was a human spine, and not far from that, they found a skull. The rangers kept searching. They found a purple and gray Osprey backpack. Inside were rental car keys, a Nikon camera, some toilet paper, and a half-full water bladder. In January of 2020, the remains were officially identified as Paul Miller. The evidence at the scene told a story, but not the whole story. It looked like Paul had made it to the oasis, then on his way back, he had gone off the main trail. And the rangers pieced together that Paul might have been seeking shelter from an intense heat in a shady crevice, but they couldn't determine exactly what had happened to him. He might have gotten disoriented from the heat, he might have had a medical emergency, like a heart attack or a stroke, or he might have fallen. The location where Paul was found wasn't even far from the trail, but the terrain in Joshua Tree is so rugged and unforgiving that searchers had walked right past this spot dozens of times without ever seeing anything. Now, I want to make a note that Paul had no history of medical issues. He was very physically fit for his age, and he was experienced in the outdoors, and he had water with him. And yet, somehow, on a routine morning hike, something had gone terribly wrong. Now, the exact cause of death was never determined, unfortunately, and his case joined the long list of mysteries in Joshua Tree National Park, where the harsh landscape can turn a simple hike into a life or death situation in a matter of moments. For Stephanie and Paul's family, the discovery of his remains at least brought some closure. But the question of what exactly happened to Paul Miller that morning in July of 2018 remains unanswered. And because you guys made it this far, I want you to all comment below National Park secrets, so that way I know who made it to the end and who didn't. If you guys enjoy this kind of cinematic storytelling, where we dive into strange cases of the mysterious and supernatural, what are you waiting for? Smack that like and subscribe button for more content just like this. As always, I love you all. Keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next episode.